The good thing about everything that I'm going to talk about is we have control over this issue. So hopefully this will be educational, and you can share this with your friends and neighbors and help us make some positive change. So just to kind of go back, and I may overlap a little bit with some of the things that Dave covered, but there's two different collection methods right now for recycling, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with these, but you have a drop-off facility where it's source separated, and what that means is that you've got one container that holds all the number 1 plastics, one container that holds number 2 plastics, one container that holds cardboard, and so on. So each individual commodity or piece of material is kind of grouped with its own like material. And then you have a curbside service, and there's two different kinds of curbside services typically. One may be a source separated where it's exclusively cardboard, and that's typically for businesses who have a lot of shipments and need to dispose of or divert that cardboard material. And then you have a commingled service where that's usually a residential service where you get to put all of your recycling into a single container, so there's no sorting required. And then ultimately where those two methods of collection of recycling will ultimately end up is one of 3 types of material recovery facilities. So those are called MRFs in the industry. And there's a clean MRF, there's a dirty MRF, and there's a wet MRF. A clean MRF is essentially what typically is found in Montana, actually exclusively in Montana, would be where all of the material is coming in and it's simply baled based on how it's collected. So in a situation where you've got a drop-off source separated, you've got a bunch of cardboard, it's baled as a cardboard bale, and like Dave said, you've either got a grade 12 or a grade 11 depending on the amount of contamination essentially that's in that bale. And then that affects the price that you can get at market. So a clean MRF is you're just taking all that material and bundling it, and then in the case of the commingled service where all of those materials are together, a clean MRF will simply bundle those bales together, and those are then sent to a dirty MRF, which is where those bales are broken open, so you've got all of them recycling mixed together, those bales are broken open, and then it goes through a sorting facility where you've got conveyors and puffs of air and lasers that are sort of mechanically and automatically sorting the materials. So those are just kind of a background on the way that recycling is collected and the process by which it is separated. So then we get into contamination, and I like to break contamination down into 2 different kinds of contamination. So we've got sort of, on the face of it seems like obvious contamination. So things like cat litter and pet waste, soiled diapers, and as I go through this list, we've seen far beyond this, but you may be kind of horrified with some of the things that you'll see on this list. But styrofoam, things that just can't, there is no real good way to dispose of them. They need to go to landfills to be safely handled. So needles, medical waste, paints and solvents. So as we kind of go through this, you can sort of see these are sort of common sense type things. But you start to get into things like bubble wrap and CDs where it feels like you should be able to recycle them, but ultimately they are trash. So these are some of the obvious contaminants that we'll often see in recycling. Then we get into the more kind of nuanced side of things, and that's the wishful or aspirational recycling contamination. And what that tends to be, bless you, what that tends to be are things like plastic bags, and this is where, in a commingled or all-in-one recycling program, I think that's where the real shift started to happen with regards to people feeling like, when you've got a recycling container and you've got your trash container, you want to feel good about putting as much into the recycling as possible. And so I think people tend to be overzealous, and that's where the wishful recyclers come in. But we see things like clothing, straws, coffee cups, and this is where it gets tricky because, some programs can take those things, some can't. Capri Sun packets, and you'll see the dirty peanut butter jar down there too. A lot of what we'll often find as a contaminant is food products. So you may legitimately be able to recycle a number 1 plastic, but if it's covered with mayonnaise or peanut butter or the salad dressing and some residual food material, ultimately what ends up happening is that not only that piece of plastic is contaminated with the food product, but as it goes through the waste stream, and is collected and baled and then sent to a sorting facility, it will often sort of infect and contaminate all the things around it. So you can imagine if you've got a half-full jar of mayonnaise and a bunch of office paper and cardboard boxes, that squirts out onto all of that, and those materials become contaminated as well. Now with China and its regulations that they put onto what they were accepting into the country, they were looking at what was 0.5% of contamination rate. So if a container, if they opened up a container full of recycled bales and if it moves more than 0.5% contaminated, they could turn it away. And so you can see where literally one jumbo-sized Costco thing of mayonnaise could squirt all over, all of the, and ultimately contaminate that entire bale and ultimately that entire load. So all of our hard work in transporting it, collecting it, sorting it, baling it, getting it to market, getting it literally to a point where somebody is going to buy it and recycle it, it can still be turned away at that point. So you can see that contamination is a really important issue and something that the more we understand and the more we can mitigate, the better the recycling is going to be long term and the healthier those markets can become. Because really this is, and I see Jeremy Drake in the back, and I want to recount really quickly a conversation that we had whenever I first started. So I've been in the industry about 6 years, and his comment to me was, I worry about a single stream process where all of the recycling is put together, because I feel like there's a possibility, and research has shown that you tend to get more participation, but in increasing participation you also get more contamination. So in my 5 years in the industry and seeing what I've seen, I'm a firm believer in the need to really either be vigilant about making sure that you understand the process and understand how to reduce contamination, and also maybe looking at options where we're just not doing those all-in-one commingled programs as much or anymore. So that's kind of a breakdown of the two types of contamination and their impacts. So obviously some of these are going to be kind of obvious impacts, but ultimately they're things that we need to understand, and I think education is going to provide an opportunity for us to start to make some positive change. So obviously, like Dave said, contamination lowers diversion rates. So you may have an entire truck full of 90% of it can be clean recycling, and you get something like this that's in the mix that gets churned through the entire collection, and it then becomes garbage. So literally the few bad apples that spoil the bunch analogy is true with regards to contamination and recycling. So right now, pretty much industry-wide, we're seeing about 25, like Dave said, 25 to 30% of our recycling is contaminated and is actually garbage. Again, impacts, decreased value of recovered materials. So again, that's the grease. So this was actually at our Valley Recycling. Mike took these pictures for me, where all of this nice clean cardboard that's fantastic and has great market value has been completely contaminated and soaked in grease from a grease trap that was dumped inside of the cardboard. And then you can also see the bubble wrap and all the other non-cardboard material in there. That all went to the garbage. So that was 95+% clean, awesome cardboard, and that had to become garbage. To Dave's point, there's another impact of contamination is the damage to sorting equipment and the risk of injury to MRF employees. So those guys are in there with sawzalls and clippers and literally cutting out. So not only does it reduce efficiency in those MRFs by having to close down for an entire day to clean these out, but it's not a job that I want. Climbing underneath those big machines and doing that is pretty nasty. Obviously, the impacts of contamination increase sorting costs. So as the MRFs are trying to handle that volume, they're having to add different layers of sorting and more manpower. You see that gal's lifting up some sort of either plastic bag or clothing that shouldn't have been in the recycling stream. So what can I do? I don't like to end anything on a negative note, so the positive things that we can do is understand contamination, and the fact that you're all here now and willing to listen and share your knowledge and listen to the experts is a great step forward. Knowing your local program, like Dusty had mentioned, the lack of uniformity across the board is problematic, not only for numbering plastics and understanding where those can go, but also just the different programs. That somebody may come from Wisconsin where they collected glass in their all-in-one recycling program, and that's not the case here. So really understand your local program and know that you're following all the rules. Share your knowledge, so everything you guys learn here, share it with your friends, neighbors, families, coworkers, and volunteer. Be out in the community, work for your green teams at work or at community events, learn about your local program and be willing to go out there and share it. And last but not least, if in doubt, throw it out. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but if you've got something where it's one single thing and 90% of your recycling is clean and great, and you can't get a hold of somebody, you don't quite know if this material is accepted, just throw it in the trash, because it's better to have that one piece of plastic or whatever it is go in the trash than ultimately contaminate an entire load of recycling. And my last slide, this is just a really great history. It goes into a little bit deeper detail than what Dave gave, but it's the resourcerecycling.com, and if you just do a Google search for Green Fence China timeline, this is a really great detailed timeline going all the way back, actually before 2013, that gives you sort of a timeline of how things played out and what happened that would cause this kind of where we are now and our need to make better choices and reduce contamination. So that's what I have. Thank you.